I'm good for that. All right, now it's on. Everybody hear me?
I'm here.
Unfortunately, no. I said, can you hear me? And he said, are you here? So he couldn't hear me. I'm glad you're here, though. All right, Esther chapter 9. Remember, one of the main things that we've been pointing out, especially from this particular book, is the fact that God is in control, that He will fulfill His plans and His purposes, the supreme one of which is to redeem fallen man, to reconcile us back to Himself. And the events that take place in this particular book center on that. Even though God is not specifically mentioned, we do see that He is central to the events that transpire. There are a number of things that point out that He is in charge, even though we're not told that directly. What's the gist of the account? What is Esther about?
Being in the right place at the right time.
Being in the right place at the right time, allowing God to use us. Okay, Esther ascends to the throne as queen, and she is able by being encouraged by Mordecai to do what ultimately ends up saving the Jewish people from extermination. A decree had gone out by the king's approval. He didn't exactly pay attention, I guess, to what the decree was all about. This was before he was aware that his new queen, his wife Esther, was a Jew. And he allowed this decree to go out, this law to go out that would basically wipe out the Jews in the Babylonian or Medo-Persian Empire. And so now events have transpired that now puts the Jews back in a place of preference, and they have an advantage. And so this decree has gone out to their benefit. Mordecai is now in this position of authority. And so we're going to take up at chapter 9. What are they able to do now? The decree had been that they were to be killed, right? They were to be destroyed. Now what? Now what can they do? They can fight back. They can defend themselves. They can fight back. Obviously, there are not going to be any repercussions from the palace, from the king. They are given authority to do this, and so they are happy. And yet, at the end of verse 17 in chapter 8, it says that the people of the land. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. They became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. What does that mean? Yeah. There is a sense in which there was conversion by the sword here almost, right? Can't beat them, join them. There you go. Can't beat them, join them. I'm gonna be on the right side of this thing when all is said and done. So we have that taking place. So chapter 9. Somebody go ahead and start reading at verse 1 for us.
On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Why is there this fear? I mean, did all of a sudden the Jews, all of a sudden became skilled at sword fighting? History. Okay, they know the history and know that God is on their side, but there's something else as well, because, these people are in exile. They have the backing of the king. They have the backing of the king. I don't know that prior to this that they would have responded this way. Had it just been Haman's, will. But now the tables have turned, right? All right, so now they are stronger. Okay, keep going.
And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them.
Okay, now why that? Why did the fear of Mordecai come upon them? Why did it seize them?
Mordecai,
He was like vice president of the country.
Yeah. He has some authority now, right? All right, keep going.
Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all of their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Alphon, Sparta, Baratha, Delia, Aradatha, Amashta, Arisai, Aradai, and Brizatha.
Great job.
Haman, son of Hammedatha, was the enemy of the Jews, but they did not lay their hands on their plunder.
Okay, so it wasn't about the stuff. I'm getting a little bit of, y'all hearing that feedback or echo a little bit? Y'all hearing that? Or is it just me hearing that? Maybe it's just the voices in my head. I apologize. Okay. I'll just kind of move this down a little bit. What's that?
You're talking to your ears, right?
Let me say this, because Brother Cook was talking about this too, about fireworks. He had somebody knock on his door about 12:26 this morning. He didn't answer the door, by the way. He just stayed in bed. And then my dog was going crazy. I don't know about one bang and my dog goes crazy. But I was reminded when we lived in Memphis, we were there for New Year's Eve, and we'd already heard gunfire anyway prior to that point. We were not in the best part of town. Not that there is a best part of town necessarily, but it struck midnight and it was gunfire, including semi-automatic weapons and some automatic weapons. You could hear just brrr, bow, 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 and then every once in a while you hear a firecracker. Bing! We called 911, and you know what the response was? Yeah. Yep. Just stay down. It's happening all over the city. Nothing we can do about it. Happy New Year. Yep. Okay, sorry. All right, going back to verse 10 at the end of that. They did not lay a hand on the plunder. Why is that, you think? Wasn't really their concern?
You didn't want to get killed by the king. He would have gone with it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because it was,
I think
that would be a bad thing.
maybe, but remember on Haman's side of it, what was his desire regarding the Jews? Kill them and then what? Take everything they have. So what seems to be the disposition here? To put it bluntly, yeah. All right, so it was about defending themselves primarily, right? Okay, keep going.
The number of those slain in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted." Okay,
stop for just a minute. I do want to say this. In the citadel, what is he talking about here? The palace. This is the capital. And in this place alone, how many people have been killed? 500. I mean, when's the last time you saw that many people killed? We don't see that, right? And yet I think that sometimes we read the Bible and we just kind of read over that. 500 people were killed. Listen, this is bloody. Yeah, that's right. This is slaughter. This is pretty intense. And that's what the Bible talks about. And again, let me go back and say this. I know that we've made this observation a number of times, and I'm not saying that we need to necessarily change everything about the way we teach our children, but typically, what kind of pictures do we have in our heads when it comes to Bible events or stories? How do we imagine them? What's that? Feel-good stories. And I would kind of go back just like coloring pictures from Bible class when we were kids, right? And again, I'm not saying that we need to teach our children, every detail of this slaughter and make the coloring pages all about, blood dripping off the pages. I'm not saying that, but there is a sense in which we may have kind of misled ourselves, right? I mean, this is history. This happened. This happened. There's blood in the streets. Yeah. And again, this goes back. It's not because God loves the shedding of innocent blood, right? I mean, He hates that. But it does say something about the seriousness of His accomplishing His will. And if anyone opposes that, if anyone stands in the way, ultimately they won't stand. And so we have a choice, kind of going back to this idea that these people, proselyted into Judaism. We have a choice to make. Which side do we want to be on? I want to be with the guys that win. That may mean the ending of my physical life, but I want to be on God's side.
It's interesting that back to David's comment 2 or 3 weeks ago, if they had done their job, hanging, would have never been around, and none of this innocent bloodshed would have been shed.
Yeah. Yep. That's it. God knows best. It just makes sense to line up with Him. Just obey Him.
But you said God knows before it even happens.
Yeah.
If He knows before it even happens, He's going to let everything just sort of fall in place.
Yeah. I mean, bearing in mind, again, we want to emphasize that God allows us to make these choices. And there, let me go ahead and get into this for just a minute. There's a theological or philosophical, debate or question. If God knows ahead of time that something is going to happen, then that means we don't have a choice in the matter. I don't take that position. And I know that, and again, we are finite beings. We cannot grasp everything. But just because God knows it's going to happen doesn't mean that He causes it to happen, that He forces it to happen, right? I mean, the Bible is very clear. God begs and pleads and calls on us to obey Him. We have a choice. I can see a car coming and a person stepping off a curb. And if all things continue as they usually do, I can know what's going to happen, but did I cause it? No. Now, again, I know that that's different from God's perspective, but...
You didn't say, hey...
And is it God? Isn't God warning? He is. Okay. Anyway, God knows best. All right, let's keep going. Where were we?
If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on gallows. So the king commanded that this be done. The edict was issued in Susa, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman.
Hold on just a minute. Let's go back to these 10 sons for just a moment. Why do that? I mean, Haman was the bad guy, right? Not his sons. What's that? Yeah, all of you at once. Okay, this is great. What?
How would you hurt somebody?
What?
How would you hurt somebody? I mean, killing them is done, but you can hang your sons.
You heard? Okay, gotcha. That we reap what other people sow. What? No revenge by the sons. Yeah. Yep. This goes back to your comment a minute ago. This is the apple doesn't fall far. Listen, somebody they are going to want most likely they will want vengeance. Yeah. And you stop it right here, right now, and we don't repeat this thing again. Right? All right. So there is justice. This is a strategic political move. It just makes sense.
It's also a warning because they had already been killed, so it was just a display of the bodies.
Yeah, this is what's going to happen. Listen, this is something that we talked about while studying through Luke. The Romans were notorious for doing this. Anytime that there was an uprising, in some place that the Romans had jurisdiction over, that the Romans were over. Remember that the Romans were pretty good. I mean, as far as Palestine is concerned, as far as the Jews were concerned, they could pretty much go about obeying their law and worshiping as they wanted to worship, right? But when they stepped outside the lines, when they tried to revolt against Rome, and it wasn't just the Jews in Jerusalem, but we're talking about all nations under the province of Rome, what would the Romans do? They would shut the revolt down and make examples of those that did it. And that's what we mentioned from history, that the timber around Jerusalem disappeared in AD 70 because of all the people that were crucified outside the city as a warning. And they did that in multiple places.
Use them for light at night so they could go on their big old roads.
Oh, yeah. But it was a display. Listen, this is what happens when you revolt. And so the message is, let's not do that. Okay, keep going.
The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made the day of feasting and joy.
Isn't that interesting? 75,000 people killed. Let's have a feast tomorrow. Well, I mean, there's a reason behind that, right? We've been spared. We've been spared. This is because of God's care and providence. He is the one that ends up getting the glory here. It wasn't because, again, we're really good at battle. It was because God was fighting for them. And so they honor him in that way. So again, but let me emphasize this. 75,000 people just on this occasion died. The Jews. The Jews did. Yeah. So again, the Bible is a bloody book. All right.
One quick point, too. It never says if any or how many actual Jews were killed, too, during this battle.
Yeah. And some, isn't that interesting? Because sometimes we have it very clearly stated that the Jews were spared, that no one died in certain battles. Other times, they suffered. They suffered. And so we're not necessarily immune to the suffering of this world, are we? And I think that's another thing that we need to consider from the Bible. I know that we've pointed that out a lot, but it needs to be reemphasized because we have a tendency, and I think that this is has a great deal to do with this pseudo-gospel around us that states that if we obey God, that everything's going to be great, that God is going to prosper us materially and health-wise and so on. Listen, He might. But is that a guarantee? No. Following Christ could very well cause us to lose our lives. And so we ought not think that we are immune to these kinds of things, that we live in a real world, and we sometimes suffer the consequences of that. All right? Let me say this too. Another practical part of that is that there are people. I don't know if this is really true. I just read it. I tried to do some research to find more statistics, but I couldn't. But a large group, as far as the Christian world is concerned, those that leave certain denominations and become atheists, the prominent denomination where that happens is the Pentecostal church or Pentecostal churches. Now, if that's true, and I mean, I've seen some of these cases before, but if that's true, I would argue that one reason is because of being disillusioned. Because this particular thing is preached, these miracles will happen, God will bless you in this way and this way, and then it doesn't happen, what happens to that person? They lose faith in God, yeah. Their faith was based on a faulty system, and when the system failed, their faith failed. I mean, one of I think it was that first, Dan Barker, the first guy that Kyle Butt debated, the atheist that he debated, used to be a Pentecostal preacher and is now a prominent atheist. And if you go back and you watch that debate, some of his arguments kind of were based on this idea of so-called miracles. Yeah, it was a faulty foundation. So again, the practical part of this is that even God's people can suffer. And so that ought not shake our faith at all. Okay? Keep going. Where did we stop? I don't even remember where we stopped. Okay.
The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies. And as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and the mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another, and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the fur, that is, the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on gallows. Therefore these days were called Purim, from the word pure, because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that day, and their descendants and all who joined them should without fail observe these 2 days every year, in a way prescribed in the time of Moses. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, and in every province and every city. And in these days, the Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among your descendants.
Okay, let me stop for just a minute. Let me go ahead and state that some argue, and maybe absolutely right, that this really is the purpose of this book, is to record the reason behind this particular feast. And that very well might be the case. I think that primarily, though, you and I see that the bigger lesson here is that God fulfills His plans and promises. And that feast is based on that, right? Even though this plot existed to annihilate the Jews, thus to exterminate the plan of God, it failed. And so this would be a feast that would remind them of God's care and concern and His deliverance. Okay, keep going.
So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the king of Xerxes, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to the times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed that these regulations stood firm and was written down in the records.
Okay, and then read the entirety of chapter 10, if you don't mind.
Sure. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to the distant shores, and all of his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king had raised him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all Jews.
All right. It kind of gives me a chill, and I want to remind you, when kind of when we started this particular letter, one of the things that I pointed out, and maybe some of the other books as well leading up to this, we talked about this idea of just history, not just the biblical events, but just history in general. It's one thing for you and I to go into the Bible and to read it, and this is of utmost, this is more important than anything else, right? God's Word. And God's dealings with mankind in history. And history has really revolved around that. But from the historical side of things, from that vantage point, separate and apart from the Bible, just pretending that we don't know anything about the biblical record, this should be of interest to us. Because here we have this tribe of people who had somehow made it into this sliver of very strategic land, had been battled over century after century. Seemingly nobody's really, and God even points that out. And yet they find themselves second in command to the greatest world leader at the time. I mean, think about that. How did all of that come about? I mean, from the secular point of view, I think that's interesting. Now we couple that with the Bible and knowing who these people are and ultimately what they are for to bring about the Messiah. It's incredible that these people find themselves again second in command in the Medo-Persian Empire. It just doesn't make any sense separate and apart from God being at work. It just doesn't. Yes, sir?
The guy there did, from what I understand, God sort of gave this king a pass, right? Sort of not necessarily, a sinner, he'll go to hell, but I mean, for a time there when he was good to the Jews, God gave him a pass.
Okay, so Brother Cook's question or comment is, did God give this king a pass? Give him a pass. Not that he's...
Oh, he's going to go to hell.
Okay, yeah, if he doesn't repent, he'll go to hell. All right, but does he give him a pass as far as this life is concerned? What's the answer to that? God's using him. And again, what was God's message through Daniel to Nebuchadnezzar? What does God do? Yeah. God rules in the kingdom of men. And so, as powerful as Xerxes might have been, he was that powerful only because God permitted him to be so. And God could use him in any way that he sees fit. Again, not necessarily manipulating his free will, but God does this. He makes kingdoms rise and fall, all to accomplish his purposes. He did it with Pharaoh. He did it with several other kings as well as Xerxes. So, yeah, in a way, God allowed him to be used by him. Okay, so now we're going to shift our attention to some of the minor prophets. That's what we're going to do this quarter. And the specific minor prophets that we're looking at are going to be the post-exilic minor prophets. What do we mean by that? What is post-exilic? What? Okay, exile. Post is what? After. After the exile. Which exile is under consideration? The Babylonian on into the Medo-Persian exile. But the Babylonian exile. And so we're going to look at the prophets that were at work, the writing prophets that were at work when the Jews were enabled and allowed to go back to Jerusalem. All right, so we're going to be looking at Zechariah, or Haggai rather, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and we're going to put Joel in here. There is a question of where Joel belongs, whether or not he really belongs with this group, but we're going to go ahead and put him in that and study his prophecy last. So we're going to start with Haggai. All right? Daniel was a great man. Yeah, we're just looking at the minor prophets. Actually, just the minor prophets. There are some interesting things. I love studying Daniel, and we're going to go back. We're going to loop back around and study those individuals like Daniel and Jeremiah and Isaiah. But right now we're going to hit these minor prophets. I will also say this regarding prophets, especially like Daniel. Just the way that we see them again in history, talking about history, and more proof that the Bible is from a higher source. You've got Daniel, for example, in Daniel 7, prophesying about the Grecian Empire, what was going to happen. He prophesies regarding specific leaders like Alexander, and then how his life would be cut off and how the kingdom would be divided amongst his generals. So Daniel is incredible, just looking at history right beside what he's talking about. So I look forward to going back and taking part in that study. So, all right, but for right now, let's look at Haggai. All right, before we do that though, any questions regarding or comments, observations, anything regarding the section that we just finished, which was what? Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Okay, so what we're doing, remember, is we're connecting this. Here's something that happens. Typically, we look at the Bible and the way it's laid out, and a lot of people anyway, and I catch myself maybe even sometimes engaged in this. I have in the past, definitely. But we fall prey to this idea of believing that the Bible is given to us in chronological order. That all of the events of the kings, for example, took place, and then later on you have the prophets. When in fact, what do we do? And with the exile, the same thing that we're doing. You take the prophets and you can plug them into those historical accounts, right? Doesn't that same thing take place with the New Testament regarding the book of Acts? Same thing, right? We don't have Acts necessarily taking place and then later on down the line, some events taking place in Philippi and Ephesus and all. Those kinds of things are happening as those events are playing out. And if not directly when they're playing out, at least they get plugged back into that background. So the same thing with the Old Testament. We have these historical events taking place, and now we're plugging in these prophets, seeing where they are plugged in. All right? All right, regarding Haggai and where we see him plugged in, he starts out in chapter 1 giving us a time frame. So somebody read chapter 1, verse 1. Come on now. Anybody? Okay, Haggai's in the Old Testament. It's right after Zephaniah. Okay, stop there. All right, so yeah, he's going to say something, but that's not our point right now. Our point right now is to see that the time frame, the second year of King Darius in the 6th month, first day of the month, Haggai the prophet to whom? Starts with a Z. Zerubbabel, all right. Remember, we've seen something about him before, right? We've read about Zerubbabel before, haven't we? Yeah. Remember, there were 3 carryings away regarding the Babylonian exile, 3 carryings away, and 3 returns. Right? Ezra, Nehemiah, we have Zerubbabel. All right. Matter of fact, let's go back to Ezra for just a moment, chapter 5. Ezra chapter 5. Somebody read 5, 1 and 2. Ezra 5, 1 and 2. No awkward silence, please. Somebody read.
Now the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judea and Jerusalem in the name of God of Israel, who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Mordecai, rose and began to rebuild the house of God that is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them.
Okay, so this gives us a time frame and also the circumstances, right? This is in the days of Zerubbabel, and what was going on? What event? Rebuilding. Okay, so we have this rebuilding of the wall, rebuilding of the temple, and some things. Remember what we studied before, that when they go back, at first there's a good amount of zeal going on, right? Happening. Excited about it. And then some threats arise. And then what happens to the work? Yeah, it just stops for a while. Stops for a while. They have a responsibility to rebuild. And they fail in that responsibility. So God raises up a prophet. He raises up Haggai. And so that gives us a little bit of the idea of behind this particular prophet. How much time do we have? 5 minutes? Okay. We won't necessarily get into the text that much here, but I do want to keep in mind this. As we read through this, here's what the tendency typically is, especially when we get into prophetic type books. We start daydreaming and drifting off, and it might tend to get dry and all of that. I want us to dig, please dig, mentally and intellectually into the book and look for some lessons and some observations. Remember again, the big picture has to do with what the Bible is all about, right? It's the inspired record of God's unfolding plan to rescue fallen man, right? So the question is, what does Haggai have to do with that? What does he have to do? Because that applies to us. God's reaching out to rescue you and me that's everything that we're about. So what does Haggai have to do with that? And it's in that we find some application. Does that make sense? Okay. So I would encourage you, I tell you what, we're just going to go ahead and end a little bit early. It's not obviously a very long book at all, just a couple of chapters. So over the next week, read it, and then read it again. And it's so short that you could probably read it about
6 times?
Yeah, a day. That's right, 6 times a day. Brother Cook has made the assignment. 6 times a day, read this particular book as per Brother Cook. And then we will be prepared for class next week. All right. Dismissed.